Liam Drake had never been one for conflict. After years of working in logistics for a mid-sized corporation in the city, he had grown tired of endless meetings, fluorescent lights, and the shallow kind of ambition that came with office life. When his father passed, leaving behind the family's neglected farm at the edge of the county, Liam didn't hesitate. He packed what little he owned, left his apartment behind, and drove 3 hours south to the wide open land where he had spent his childhood summers chasing chickens and falling asleep to the hum of crickets. The farm wasn't much to look at anymore. Weathered fences, a sagging barn, and fields overgrown with weeds, but to Liam, it was a promise. A place where he could start over, live by his own rhythm, and finally feel like he belonged somewhere again. He threw himself into the work with a kind of devotion that bordered on obsession. Each morning began before sunrise, the air still cool and damp, and he'd walk the perimeter of his land, boots sinking into the soft earth as the first light spilled across the fields. He repaired the chicken coop by hand, reinforced the barn roof, and built a small greenhouse from salvaged wood. His hands toughened, his body ached, but there was satisfaction in every blister, in every nail driven into place. The farm began to come alive again, slowly, stubbornly, just as he remembered it from his childhood. He could feel his father's presence in the creak of the porch boards and the distant smell of rain on freshly turned soil. The chickens were his first real investment. A dozen Rhode Island Reds and 2 roosters he'd bought from a nearby agricultural fair. He named them all, though he'd never admitted to anyone, and spent hours making sure they had space to roam, feeding them scraps from his kitchen and talking to them in the quiet evenings. There was something grounding about the routine, about caring for living things that depended entirely on him. For the first time in years, his anxiety quieted. He no longer woke in the middle of the night to the weight of city noise and unfinished work. The silence here was deep and honest. But peace never lasts long when other people think they can own it. The first letter arrived 2 months after he moved in. It came in a glossy envelope with gold lettering across the top. Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association. He almost laughed when he read it. He didn't live in Hawthorne Ridge. His property sat a mile beyond the subdivision, clearly marked on old zoning maps as agricultural. Still, curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. The message inside was anything but friendly. It was a notice of violation citing him for maintaining livestock within a residential development, demanding that he remove all poultry from the property within 15 days or face a fine of $250 per day. He read the letter twice, his brow furrowed, trying to make sense of it. Livestock? He was on a farm. The land had been zoned agricultural for nearly a century, long before Hawthorne Ridge even existed. He placed the letter on the kitchen table, next to a cup of coffee gone cold, and stared at it for a long time. A mistake, he thought. Someone at the HOA must have misfiled the address or sent the notice by accident. He'd clear it up easily enough. But when he called the number printed at the bottom, a woman's sharp voice answered, clipped, rehearsed, and void of empathy. "Mr. Drake," she said after he explained the situation. All properties within the Hawthorne boundary must adhere to HOA regulations. Poultry and livestock are prohibited. Liam tried to interject, telling her his land wasn't within any HOA boundary, but she cut him off. "Our records indicate your parcel is under association jurisdiction," she insisted. "You'll need to remove the animals or submit a compliance plan." Then the line went dead. The call left him with a hollow sense of disbelief, followed quickly by anger. He knew his land. He had the deed, the zoning certificate, even the survey from when his grandfather purchased the adjoining acre in 1954. But something about the tone of that woman, that calm authority, made his stomach twist. It wasn't just a clerical error. It was a threat dressed in bureaucracy. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the sky turn the color of ash, He thought about his father's warnings, the old man's gravelly voice echoing in memory. People like that, son, they don't want to own just their land. They want to own what's around it, too. Liam had always thought it was cynicism born of age. Now, staring at the letter under the dim porch light, he realized it might have been a warning. The quiet life he had come here to build was already being chipped away by something cold, organized, and deliberate. And for the first time since coming home, he felt the old restlessness of the city creeping back into his bones. The next morning, Liam woke with the uneasy feeling that the previous day's letter hadn't been a mistake at all, but the first strike in something larger. The sun had barely risen, and already the air outside was heavy with humidity, the kind that made the grass stick to his boots as he walked out to feed the chickens. The hens clucked and jostled, unaware of anything beyond their fenced little world, and for a moment he envied them, their uncomplicated rhythm of eating, nesting, and waiting for dawn. But the sight of the white envelope sitting on his porch table pulled him back into the reality he was now facing. It was another letter, stamped with the same golden crest of the Hawthorne Ridge Homeowners Association. This time it was thicker, containing several pages of legal language and a bright red heading at the top. Final notice before action. Liam felt the heat rising in his chest as he read through it. The letter accused him not only of harboring unapproved livestock, but also of creating nuisance conditions, including odor, noise, and health hazards inconsistent with community standards. They were giving him 7 days to remove all poultry or face escalating fines, property lines, and possible legal action. He read it twice to be sure he wasn't imagining the absurdity. His land wasn't even part of Hawthorne Ridge. Their community started nearly a full mile down the road. He'd seen their manicured lawns, the identical mailboxes, and the sign at the entrance that read, "A modern rural lifestyle." They had nothing to do with him. Yet here they were, dictating how he could live on property that had been his family's for generations. He drove into town that afternoon, the letter folded neatly in his pocket, determined to clear things up once and for all. The county agricultural office sat in an aging brick building that smelled faintly of paper and dust, the kind of place where bureaucracy felt slower but more honest. He approached the front desk, where a woman with silver hair and reading glasses looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked in a voice that carried the calm patience of someone who dealt with confused property owners for decades. Liam explained the situation as best he could. How the HOA was trying to fine him for keeping chickens even though his land was zoned agricultural. How they insisted his property fell under their control. She listened without interrupting, her brow furrowing slightly as he spoke. When he finished, she turned to her computer, typing for a moment before swiveling the monitor so he could see. "You're right," she said matter-of-factly. "Your parcel is zoned AG2, agricultural use. That means you have full rights to keep poultry, livestock, and maintain a working farm. HOA rules don't apply to you." The relief that washed over Liam was immediate but short-lived. "Can I get that in writing?" he asked. She smiled faintly, already printing a certificate of zoning confirmation with the county seal. "You're not the first person who's come in about Hawthorne Ridge," she said as she signed the bottom of the document. "They've been expanding their claims, trying to include properties that were never part of their charter. Be careful. They can make life difficult if you let them." Liam thanked her, took the document, and drove home, feeling cautiously optimistic. He imagined handing the letter to the HOA president and watching the smug bureaucracy crumble in the face of hard evidence. The optimism lasted exactly 2 days. On Thursday afternoon, a dark SUV rolled slowly up his gravel driveway. 3 people stepped out. 2 men in identical navy suits and a woman in a crisp white blouse with a clipboard. They looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of his weathered barn and open fields. The woman introduced herself as Ms. Keller, Compliance Director for the Hawthorne Ridge HOA. Her tone was rehearsed, polite in a way that made it sound like a performance. "Mr. Drake," she began, "we've received reports of continuing violations on your property. Our board has reviewed the case, and I'm here to inform you that non-compliance will result in daily fines and potential legal action." Liam handed her the document from the agricultural office, his voice steady but sharp. "This proves you have no jurisdiction here. My property is zoned agricultural, not residential. You have no authority over me, my land, or my animals." She glanced at the paper without taking it, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Zoning can be subject to reinterpretation," she said smoothly. "Our development agreement with the county allows for certain discretionary oversight in neighboring properties to preserve community standards." Liam felt his jaw tighten. "Preserve community standards?" he repeated. "You built your houses on farmland that wasn't even supposed to be developed, and now you're pretending you own the rest of it too?" The woman didn't respond. She just smiled thinly and said, "We'll be in touch." The trio got back into their SUV and left, the sound of gravel spraying beneath their tires echoing through the fields like a quiet threat. That evening, Liam noticed a few of his chickens missing. At first, he thought they might have wandered through a gap in the fence, but the tracks in the dirt told a different story. Someone had entered the coop. There were boot prints, deep and deliberate, leading to the gate and back out toward the road. The next morning, a notice was taped to his mailbox. Laminated, official-looking, with the HOA's emblem at the top. It accused him of defacing community property, a claim that made no sense until he noticed the small wooden boundary marker at the edge of his field. It had been freshly painted in bright blue, and a new sign had been driven into the ground beside it. Hawthorne Ridge North, Community Perimeter. His stomach turned as he read it. They were expanding their boundary line onto his property, physically marking it as their own. He called the county office again, furious, but this time the clerk sounded uneasy. "Mr. Drake," she said carefully, "I just checked the database. There's a new development overlay filed 2 days ago that lists your parcel as part of Hawthorne Ridge's buffer zone. It doesn't change your zoning status, but it gives them limited enforcement rights for aesthetic and environmental compliance." Liam gripped the phone tighter, his voice rising. "They filed that without my consent." The woman sighed softly. "They don't need your consent if the county approved it. You'll have to challenge it through legal channels." He hung up, his pulse pounding in his temples. By nightfall, he could feel the old, familiar burn of helpless anger building in him. He'd left the city to escape this exact kind of corporate arrogance, yet here it was again. Smiling faces, paperwork, and the illusion of authority used as a weapon. He stood in the middle of his yard, staring at the blinking lights of the subdivision in the distance, thinking how close they had crept without him noticing. From his porch, he could see the rooftops of new houses glinting under the setting sun, their driveways lined with matching mailboxes, their yards uniform and artificial. He realized with a sinking certainty that this wasn't about chickens. The hens were just a pretext, a distraction. What they wanted was his land, the last stretch of open space between their neat development and the county road. As darkness settled, Liam sat at his kitchen table with the 2 letters spread before him, one from the HOA, one from the county, and beside them the zoning certificate that now felt more fragile than ever. He tried to picture how far they would go, how much pressure they would apply before he broke. But he also felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a stubborn defiance rising through the fear. They thought he was just another quiet man they could bully into submission. Someone who would fold under the weight of official language and veiled threats. They didn't know that he had spent his whole life watching his father fight for every acre of this land, for every right they were now trying to erase. The night outside was still and heavy, the cicadas humming like static in the dark. He looked out at the coop, at the faint movement of feathers behind the wire, and whispered to himself, almost like a vow. They picked the wrong farmer to mess with. Liam woke to the sound of an engine idling outside his gate. It was still early, the light gray and soft through the mist, and for a moment he thought maybe one of the neighbors had taken a wrong turn, but as he stepped out onto the porch, he saw the same black SUV from before, parked by his fence. Two men stood beside it, wearing orange safety vests this time, though their polished shoes and expensive watches made it clear they weren't workers. One held a clipboard, the other a camera, snapping photos of the coop, the barn, even the porch where Liam stood barefoot, mug of coffee in hand. "Can I help you?" he called, his voice cutting through the quiet. The man with the clipboard turned, his face unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. "Routine inspection," he said smoothly, "documenting violations of community standards for Hawthorne Ridge." Liam felt his stomach twist, that same mix of disbelief and anger that had been building for weeks. "You have no jurisdiction here," he said, walking down the steps. "This is private property, agricultural land. You don't get to come onto my farm and take pictures." The man barely reacted. "Our development's expansion agreement allows visual assessments from public vantage points," he said, gesturing toward the road, though he was standing well inside Liam's fence. "We're ensuring compliance with the ongoing environmental review." Liam stepped closer until they were only a few feet apart. "Then you can take your review and your clipboard and get the hell off my land." For a long second, the man just stared, then gave a small, contemptuous smile before signaling to the other. "Let's go. He'll be hearing from legal." When the SUV finally rolled away, Liam's hands were trembling. He wasn't sure if it was from anger or the creeping realization that this wasn't going to stop. That afternoon, a certified envelope arrived, this one from the county zoning board. It stated that Hawthorne Ridge had filed a complaint citing him for non-compliance with environmental standards due to animal waste runoff risk. Attached was a notice that an inspection would occur within 72 hours. It was written in the detached language of bureaucracy, but the message was clear. The HOA had escalated the fight, and now they were pulling government strings. He knew what this was. They were using technicalities to force him into submission, counting on the fact that one man couldn't afford a prolonged legal defense. But they underestimated how much this land meant to him. That night he stayed up late in his father's old office, surrounded by boxes of dusty papers and maps. He found the original deed, yellowed and soft at the edges, showing the property's agricultural designation dating back to 1912. He dug through folders of county correspondence from the 1970s when his grandfather fought off an earlier development attempt. The documents were a testament to decades of stubbornness, a family's quiet resistance against people who saw land only as profit. Liam scanned everything, uploading digital copies to a cloud drive and printing duplicates to keep in his truck. He wasn't going to be blindsided again. When the inspector arrived 2 days later, she looked more nervous than hostile. She was young, maybe late 20s, carrying a clipboard almost too large for her. She introduced herself as Alyssa from County Environmental, her voice polite but uneasy. "I just need to take a few samples of soil and water near your coop," she said, glancing toward the chickens pecking at the ground. Liam followed her silently as she worked, watching her take careful measurements, scribbling notes. After a while, she looked up at him and hesitated. "Off the record," she said quietly. "You should know that your property's completely compliant. I've seen the files. These complaints, they're coming from someone high up in the HOA. My supervisor said to be thorough." with this one. She didn't elaborate, but her eyes told him everything. Someone was leaning on the county to make his life difficult. When she left, she slipped him her card and said, almost apologetically, "If they send another team, call me first." By the end of the week, more letters arrived, 3 in total. One claimed he was in violation for improper fencing. Another accused him of unauthorized signage, referring to the small farm fresh eggs board he'd placed by the road. The third was the most infuriating, a cease and desist order threatening legal action for business activity incompatible with residential zoning. Each letter cited a different regulation, written in legal jargon that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate. Liam felt the weight of it all pressing down like a physical force, but every time he looked out at the chickens or the rows of tomatoes he'd planted by hand, he reminded himself what he was fighting for. He decided to confront the source directly. The next day, he drove to the Hawthorne Ridge Community Center, a sterile glass building that looked more like a corporate office than anything resembling a neighborhood hub. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh paint. A woman at the front desk looked up as he entered, her smile tight. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "I'm here to speak with your board president," Liam said evenly. "Tell them it's about property boundary overreach." The woman's expression faltered, and for a moment she looked like she wanted to tell him to leave, but instead she made a call and told him to wait. 10 minutes later, a tall man in a gray suit appeared, his expression perfectly neutral. "Mr. Drake," he said, extending a hand that Liam didn't take. "I'm Richard Elwood, president of the Hawthorne Ridge Association. What seems to be the issue?" Liam took a breath, forcing his voice to stay calm. "The issue," he said, "is that your people are trespassing, filing false complaints, and trying to claim land that doesn't belong to you. My property is zoned agricultural, and I have proof." He handed Richard a copy of the certificate and the old deed. Richard skimmed it without much interest, then placed it on the table. "Zoning designations can evolve," he said. "We have a development agreement with the county that supersedes some of the older records. Our goal is simply to maintain harmony and protect community value." Liam leaned forward. "Harmony?" he repeated. "You've broken into my property, stolen livestock, and harassed me for weeks. That's not harmony. That's intimidation." Richard's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "You misunderstand," he said quietly. "We're giving you an opportunity to cooperate before this gets unpleasant. Hawthorne Ridge represents progress, Mr. Drake. We can't have outliers jeopardizing that." He rose to his feet, signaling the meeting was over. "I'd suggest you consider selling before things escalate further." Liam stared at him, a slow burn of anger spreading through his chest. "You think you can scare me into giving up my land?" he said finally. "This isn't just dirt to me. It's my family's history. You can bury it under paperwork and call it progress, but I'm not moving." Richard gave a small dismissive nod. "Then I suppose we'll let the courts decide," he said, already turning away. "Good day, Mr. Drake." Driving home, Liam could barely focus on the road. His pulse thudded in his ears, and every turn of the wheel seemed to carry the echo of Richard's calm arrogance. He understood now that this wasn't about chickens or property lines. It was a takeover, and they wouldn't stop until they owned everything between their polished streets and the county border. When he pulled into his driveway, the late afternoon light slanting across the fields, he saw something that froze him in place. The boundary sign that had been at the far edge of his land was gone, replaced with a new one driven deeper into his property. This one larger, cleaner, with a reflective logo that read, "Future Phase of Hawthorne Ridge Development." The message couldn't have been clearer. They weren't bluffing. They were already planning to erase him from the map. That night he loaded his father's old shotgun, not out of fear, but as a statement to himself. He wasn't leaving. If they wanted a fight, they would find him waiting. The quiet hum of the crickets outside felt different now, less peaceful and more like a warning, a low chorus echoing through the dark that somewhere beyond the fence, the battle for his land had already begun. By the middle of July, the heat had turned the fields brittle and dry, and the tension that had been growing around Liam's property felt just as parched, ready to ignite with the smallest spark. He had stopped sleeping through the night, waking at every sound from outside. The hum of distant engines, the occasional slam of a car door, the flicker of light that might have been headlights or flashlights sweeping across his fence. He told himself it was paranoia that the HOA wouldn't go that far, but deep down he knew better. When people like that wanted something, they didn't stop at paperwork. They used intimidation, bureaucracy, and, when necessary, quiet force. It was the same old story of power dressed up in the language of civility. The turning point came one morning when Liam found a drone hovering low over his coop. The faint whine of its rotors blended with the clucks of the chickens until he realized what he was hearing wasn't just another insect in the heat. The drone dipped closer, its lens glinting in the sun, recording him as he stepped outside. Without thinking, he grabbed a shovel and hurled a handful of dirt at it, watching as it veered upward and buzzed back toward the direction of the subdivision. He knew exactly where it had come from. When he walked down to the end of his driveway, he found a white SUV parked across the road, engine running, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. The moment he raised his phone to take a picture, the vehicle sped off, the dust cloud hanging in the air long after it disappeared. That was when he decided to stop reacting and start fighting back. That afternoon, he drove into the county seat and met again with the woman from the agricultural office, the one who had helped him before. Her name was Ellen, and she looked uneasy as soon as he mentioned Hawthorne Ridge. "You're not the only one," she said in a lowered voice. "They've been pushing for rezoning across several parcels. They want the entire stretch reclassified for mixed-use development, residential and commercial. If they get that approved, every farm around here could be forced into compliance." Liam leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "But they don't even have the right to build out that far. There's a floodplain boundary. They'd need special exemption permits for construction." Ellen hesitated, then pulled a folder from her desk drawer. "You didn't get this from me," she said, sliding it across to him. Inside were maps, blueprints, and scanned emails between the HOA's legal representatives and a real estate investment group called Fairmont Holdings. The correspondence was months old, discussing strategic land acquisitions and anticipated resistance from legacy property owners. His name wasn't mentioned, but the implication was clear. They were planning to absorb his land as part of their expansion, and the zoning battles were only the first step. On his way home, Liam stopped by a friend's workshop on the outskirts of town. Mark Danner was a local surveyor and part-time mechanic who'd grown up with Liam. They hadn't spoken much in recent years, but Mark still remembered the old days when their fathers worked side by side. When Liam explained what was happening, Mark let out a low whistle. "They're trying to strong-arm you with zoning claims. That's classic development playbook," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "They redraw maps, shift boundaries on paper, and by the time anyone notices, it's already filed with the county clerk." He led Liam to a cluttered desk in the corner and pulled up a digital map on his computer. "Here," he said, zooming in on the border between Liam's property and Hawthorne Ridge. "See that thin red line? That's the original boundary. But look, this overlay here, the one labeled Phase 3 Expansion, they've shifted it nearly 200 yards east, right into your lot. It's not legal, not without a new public hearing." Liam's pulse quickened as he stared at the evidence. "Can you print that?" Mark nodded. "I can do better. I'll get you the certified survey data and time-stamped satellite records. If this ever goes to court, that's gold." Back at the farm, Liam spent the evening sorting through the documents from Ellen and Mark. The sun had dipped below the tree line, and the fields were bathed in a deep amber light that made everything look almost peaceful, though the tension in his chest told a different story. He spread the maps across the kitchen table, comparing the old plats to the new development overlay, tracing with his finger where the HOA had effectively redrawn reality. The more he looked, the clearer it became that they hadn't just overreached, they'd crossed into outright illegality. Somewhere in the process, someone at the county must have signed off on it, knowingly or not. He thought of Richard Elwood with his practiced smile and careful threats, and felt a surge of cold anger. That night his resolve hardened into something sharper. He called a property lawyer recommended by Ellen, a woman named Dana Cross who specialized in land use disputes. When she answered, her tone was brisk but not unfriendly. He explained everything. The letters, the drone, the altered maps, the mysterious development plans. There was a long pause on the other end before she said, "It sounds like they're trying to expand their development illegally and using the HOA as cover. I've seen this before. Developers use shell associations to push out small owners and then rezone once no one's left to object." Liam exhaled slowly. "So, what can I do?" She replied, "First, file a formal complaint with the state zoning board and attach those documents. Second, get witness statements, anyone who's seen them trespassing or tampering with your property. Third, be careful. If they've gone this far, they won't stop at paperwork." The next day, Liam began gathering statements. Mark agreed to testify about the map alterations. The young county inspector, Alyssa, quietly sent him copies of her reports, confirming that there were no environmental violations on his land. Even Ellen provided an affidavit stating his property was exempt from HOA oversight. By the end of the week, Liam had assembled a small mountain of evidence, neatly organized into folders and backed up digitally. He felt for the first time that he had a fighting chance. Then came the retaliation. One morning, he woke to find his front gate torn from its hinges and tire tracks gouged deep into the dirt road. The chickens were scattered, several missing, and one of the water troughs had been overturned. He called the sheriff, who arrived hours later, a man named Harlan, broad-shouldered and polite but disinterested. After listening to Liam's account, Harlan shrugged. "Can't prove who did it," he said, jotting notes lazily. "Probably teenagers." Liam stared at him, incredulous. Teenagers don't drive black SUVs and know how to remove a steel gate without tools. The deputy avoided his gaze. "Look, I'll file a report, but I'd suggest you keep things civil with the HOA. They've got influence in this county." The warning was implicit. That night, sitting on his porch with the broken gate leaning against a post, Liam thought about everything he'd learned. The false zoning overlays, the forged complaints, the web of investors hiding behind the HOA's pristine suburban facade. It wasn't just greed. It was an entire system built to erase people like him, those who didn't fit into their grid of profit and conformity. But there was something they hadn't accounted for. He wasn't alone anymore. People like Ellen, Mark, and Alyssa had seen enough to take his side. He decided to go one step further. 2 days later, Liam drove to the local agricultural extension office with a thumb drive full of documents. He met with a regional supervisor named Carl Patterson, a man with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of dealing with rural politics. After reviewing the data, Carl leaned back in his chair, his face tightening. "This is bad," he said finally. "They've been filing fake overlays under the name of a county contractor who hasn't worked here in years. These filings are illegal. If you'll allow me, I'll forward this to the state's attorney's office." Liam nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Do it," he said. Carl hesitated, then added, "You should also prepare yourself. Once this becomes public, they'll know it came from you." That evening, when Liam returned home, the air felt electric, as if the entire property was holding its breath. The sky was bruised with thunderclouds, and a storm rolled in from the west. As rain began to fall, he stood by the window, watching the fields shimmer in the flashes of lightning. He thought of his father and grandfather, men who had fought their own battles for this land, and felt a grim satisfaction that the fight had finally come to him. They had tried to make him a bystander in his own life, a man buried under notices and fines, but they had pushed too far. He was done playing defense. Tomorrow he would go to the press, and this time it wouldn't just be about chickens or zoning lines. It would be about exposing the truth behind Hawthorne Ridge. The shiny, smiling machine that pretended to be a community but was built on coercion and fraud. The storm outside raged harder, thunder rolling over the hills like cannon fire, and for the first time in months, Liam felt something close to peace. Not because the battle was over, but because he finally knew which side of it he stood on. The article went live on a Thursday morning. By noon, it had been shared across local news outlets, spreading faster than Liam could have imagined. The headline was blunt and unapologetic. Local farmer exposes HOA zoning fraud. County investigates possible corruption. His name was there in black and white, along with a photo of his property and excerpts from the documents he'd provided. The piece outlined the forged maps, the intimidation tactics, and the links between the Hawthorne Ridge HOA and Fairmont Holdings. It didn't take long for the reaction to begin. Calls started flooding his phone. Reporters, neighbors, even strangers offering support or asking for interviews. For a brief, surreal moment, he felt victorious, like sunlight breaking through weeks of storm clouds. But victories in fights like his never came without cost. That evening, as he drove back from town, he noticed a white pickup parked halfway up his driveway, engine idling, headlights off. He slowed his truck, the gravel crunching under his tires, but the pickup didn't move. When he rolled down his window, the driver's door opened and two men stepped out. He recognized one immediately. It was the same man who had stood by the SUV weeks ago, the one with the clipboard and the smirk that made his blood boil. "Evening, Mr. Drake," the man said, voice calm but hard. "Quite the stir you've caused." Liam kept his hands on the wheel. "You're trespassing," he said quietly. "Leave now." The man smiled faintly. "You've made some serious accusations against good people. You might want to think about whether you really want to keep this going." The second man circled behind the pickup, his movements deliberate, watching Liam's truck from the corner of his eye. For a moment, the night was silent except for the rhythmic hum of crickets and the faint metallic ping of the cooling engine. Then the first man spoke again, his tone dropping. "You think this land is worth ruining your life over? Everyone else learned how to cooperate. You should too." Liam didn't answer. He simply reached for his phone, aimed it toward them, and snapped a picture. The man's smile vanished. "Suit yourself," he said, turning back toward the truck. "But don't say you weren't warned." The pickup pulled away slowly, its taillights glowing like embers as it disappeared down the road. When Liam checked his chickens the next morning, he found the coop door hanging open. 4 birds were gone, and one lay dead near the fence, its neck broken cleanly. The air was thick with the smell of damp straw and rot, and the silence of the yard pressed on him like a weight. He buried the dead hen near the oak tree and stood there for a long time, the anger inside him burning cold now, not fiery but focused. They wanted to break him, to make him sell or retreat, but they didn't understand the kind of stubbornness that had been bred into him from childhood. His father had fought drought, debt, and banks, but he'd never surrendered, and Liam wasn't about to either. That afternoon, he met again with his lawyer, Dana Cross. She looked both impressed and concerned when he told her about the encounter with the men and the vandalism. "They're trying to push you into making a mistake," she said. "If you retaliate, they'll use it against you. But this intimidation, this could qualify as harassment. I'll file a restraining order against the HOA board on your behalf." Liam nodded, though he could already tell she doubted how much that would help. People like Richard Elwood didn't leave fingerprints on their orders. They let others get their hands dirty. A week later, the retaliation shifted from threats to outright sabotage. His power flickered off one night and didn't return until morning. The electric company said there had been localized maintenance in his area, but his neighbors down the road hadn't experienced any outages. Then, the following evening, a code enforcement officer arrived unannounced with a citation for unsafe structures after an anonymous complaint claimed his barn roof was collapsing. The officer was apologetic, muttering that he was just following procedure. But the message was clear. They were tightening the noose, one form, one inspection, one accusation at a time. Meanwhile, the media attention had drawn others out of the shadows. A retired county engineer contacted him privately, confirming what Liam already suspected, that Hawthorne Ridge's expansion had been rubber-stamped through bribes. The engineer shared copies of old correspondence and an internal memo from Fairmont Holdings, describing anticipated legal obstacles from legacy landowners, with his parcel highlighted in red. The memo outlined a strategy. Use compliance leverage via HOA enforcement to neutralize resistance. It was proof not just of corruption, but of a deliberate, calculated campaign. Liam forwarded the documents to Donna, who immediately filed a formal motion for injunction. But as his case gained momentum, his isolation grew. Some neighbors who had once waved from their cars now drove past without making eye contact. A few whispered warnings reached him, rumors that the HOA was planning to sue him for defamation. Flyers appeared on mailboxes in the nearby development, portraying him as a troublemaker, obstructing community progress. It was propaganda, polished and persuasive, and it worked. By the end of the month, he noticed cars slowing near his gate, strangers taking photos of his property, and online comments calling him unstable and anti-growth. They weren't just attacking him legally. They were dismantling his reputation. Despite it all, Liam pressed forward. He hired an independent surveyor to testify in court and gave a long interview to a regional newspaper, laying out every detail of the fraud. The reporter, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Grace Heller, spent hours on the farm, photographing the falsified boundary markers and interviewing his allies. "They've been using intimidation to steal land under the pretense of order," she said as she packed up her camera. "People need to see how deep this goes." Her story ran 2 days later, drawing state-level attention and sparking public outrage. For the first time, county officials couldn't ignore it. The state zoning board announced an investigation into the Hawthorne Ridge development permits. That night, someone fired a gun near his property. The sound echoed through the dark like a whip crack, followed by the sharp whine of a bullet hitting metal somewhere near the barn. He dropped to the ground instinctively, heart hammering in his chest. When he dared to look up, he saw the faint outline of a vehicle disappearing down the road, tires spitting gravel. The next morning, the sheriff returned, this time with 2 deputies. They found the bullet lodged in one of the metal panels near the coop. "Could be hunters," Harlan said, though the look in his eyes betrayed that even he didn't believe it. "I'll file a report, but unless you saw who did it." He let the sentence trail off. Liam didn't respond. He just stared out at the fields, the morning mist curling low around the grass, and realized how far this had gone. By the time the preliminary court hearing was scheduled, the HOA's veneer of professionalism had begun to crack. Whispers spread that Richard Elwood had stepped back from public appearances and that the HOA's treasurer was under state investigation for falsifying financial statements. But that only made them more dangerous. The night before the hearing, someone spray-painted across his barn in red letters, "Sell or bleed." The words glowed under the pale moonlight, crude and dripping. He stood there for a long while, the smell of paint thick in the air, and then, without hesitation, fetched a bucket of whitewash and began covering it himself. Every stroke of the brush steadied him, every sweep across the wood reminding him that they could vandalize and threaten, but they couldn't make him surrender. When dawn came, he dressed in clean clothes, tucked the deed into his jacket pocket, and drove to the courthouse with the calm focus of someone who had already lost everything but his conviction. The road stretched before him like a thin line through a battlefield, dust, heat, and defiance in every mile. Whatever happened next, he knew there was no turning back. The second phase of their war had begun, and this time it would be fought in the open, under oath, where lies had to stand against proof. And in that quiet certainty, as the courthouse came into view, he felt not fear but clarity, a hard and steady flame that no threat could extinguish. The courthouse was already humming with subdued tension when Liam arrived. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, the sort of scent that clung to places where lives had been decided and undone for decades. He sat in the front row beside his lawyer, Dana Cross, who looked unshaken, her calm composure almost unnerving. Across the aisle sat Richard Elwood, flanked by two attorneys in dark suits and the HOA treasurer, a narrow-faced man with thinning hair who refused to look in Liam's direction. Behind them, members of the Hawthorne Ridge Board whispered among themselves, the rustle of papers mixing with the low hum of the air conditioning. The judge entered without ceremony, an older woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When she called the case to order, the murmur died instantly, leaving only the sound of shuffling feet and the creak of benches. Dana began by laying out the facts with measured precision. She presented the original zoning certificates, the forged overlays, and the emails from Fairmont Holdings that referred to targeted acquisition through regulatory leverage. Each document was projected on the courtroom screen, and with every new page, the quiet confidence on the HOA side began to fray. Richard's jaw tightened, his polite mask slipping as Dana's voice grew stronger. When she called Ellen from the agricultural office to testify, the woman confirmed under oath that Liam's property was zoned exclusively for agricultural use, and that no lawful amendment had ever been filed to change that designation. Then came Mark Danner, who explained how the development overlays had been falsified, his professional credentials making every word sound like a verdict. The final blow was the testimony from the retired county engineer, whose evidence tied Fairmont Holdings directly to the bribery of a planning commissioner. The courtroom grew still as Dana summarized the web of deceit, her voice cutting through the silence like the crack of a gavel. This association has operated not as a homeowners organization, but as an instrument of coercion, she said. They've exploited the language of law to justify theft, intimidation, and fraud. When Richard's turn came, he stood slowly, his expression solemn, his tone almost paternal. He painted a picture of misunderstanding and misplaced hostility, insisting that the HOA had only sought order and safety for the community. He claimed Liam's accusations were born from resentment and a misreading of administrative procedure. But when Dana rose again for cross-examination, the illusion unraveled. She presented the internal memo, the one where Richard himself had written, "Drake's parcel is the last obstacle before Phase 4. The courtroom stirred as he faltered for the first time, his voice catching on the word context. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Elwood," she said coolly, "are you suggesting this document has been fabricated?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, his entire defense collapsed. Liam watched the scene unfold in silence, a strange calm settling over him. Months of sleepless nights, of fear and anger and doubt, condensed into this single moment of clarity. He glanced around the courtroom, the spectators, the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, even the deputies standing near the door, and realized that the truth was no longer something he had to fight to prove. It was there, visible, undeniable, printed in black and white for everyone to see. The judge called a recess, and when she returned 30 minutes later, her verdict came swift and decisive. She declared the HOA's boundary expansions null and void, ruled that Liam's land was legally and permanently exempt from their jurisdiction, and referred the evidence of fraud to the state attorney's office for criminal investigation. The words landed like a physical weight lifting from his chest. Dana smiled faintly, exhaling a breath she'd been holding for hours. On the other side of the room, Richard sat motionless, his eyes dark and distant, the composure finally gone. The treasurer muttered something under his breath before being silenced by one of the attorneys. Reporters surged forward as the session ended, but Liam stayed seated for a long moment, staring at the seal above the judge's bench, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Quiet satisfaction that didn't need to be spoken aloud. When he finally stepped outside, the sunlight hit him like a revelation. The courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and microphones, voices shouting his name, asking how it felt to win. He didn't give them a soundbite. He simply said, "It's not about winning, it's about being left alone." Then he walked past them, down the steps, and into the open air that smelled of cut grass and summer dust. That night, back at the farm, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the sky deep and starless above him. The chickens rustled softly in their coop, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain from somewhere far off. His phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations, offers for interviews, people thanking him for standing up, but he ignored them all. In the distance, the lights of Hawthorne Ridge burned faintly, that perfect grid of uniform houses now tainted by the scandal unfolding behind their fences. He wondered if Richard was still sitting in some boardroom, staring at the ruins of his empire, or if he'd already started erasing the evidence of his name. It didn't matter. The fight had cost Liam nearly everything: money, peace, and months of his life. But as he looked out over his land, the same soil his family had tended for generations, he knew he'd done what they would have expected. The boundaries were restored, the fraud exposed, and the ghosts of intimidation finally silenced. The law had recognized what he'd known all along, that this land was his, not just by deed, but by right, by blood, by the simple truth that no corporation or council could ever buy belonging. The night was quiet again, not with the fragile calm of denial, but with the kind of peace that comes only after surviving the storm. The weeks that followed the verdict unfolded with an almost surreal stillness, as if the land itself was finally exhaling after months of suffocating pressure. The headlines faded. The reporters stopped calling, and the constant hum of anxiety that had shadowed Liam's days began to lift. The state investigation into Hawthorne Ridge widened, pulling in names that once seemed untouchable. County officials, real estate executives, and even a lawyer who had quietly approved the fraudulent boundary filings. Richard Elwood resigned before charges were formally announced, his reputation collapsing under the weight of his own deceit. The HOA dissolved soon after, its members scattering, some selling their homes, others staying but keeping their heads down. The once pristine development that had tried to consume his land now looked strangely hollow, its identical houses standing like monuments to greed and arrogance. Liam's own life, though quieter, carried a sense of renewal that felt deeper than relief. He spent his mornings repairing the barn, repainting the coop, and reseeding the fields that had gone fallow during the months of conflict. Neighbors who had once avoided him began stopping by again, some with awkward smiles and small offerings, fresh bread, tools, a simple, "glad you stood your ground." Even Ellen and Mark visited one afternoon, bringing a framed copy of the zoning certificate that had sparked the entire war. "To remind you what truth looks like on paper," Ellen said with a soft grin. He hung it in the kitchen, next to his father's old photograph, where the sunlight caught it every morning. The farm began to flourish again in slow, honest rhythms. The hens multiplied, their soft clucking once more part of the background music of his days. He started selling eggs and produce at the weekend market, not for profit, but for the satisfaction of seeing the farm return to what it was always meant to be. Alive, independent, untamed by the polished ambitions of others. At night, he would sit on the porch, listening to the crickets and the rustle of the wind through the oaks, and the silence no longer carried tension. It was full, steady, and earned. Sometimes he thought about the fight, about the fear and exhaustion that had almost broken him, and he understood something his father had once said but that he'd never grasped until now. That land is more than soil or property. It's memory, identity, and defiance made tangible. You don't truly own it by paying for it. You own it by standing your ground when someone tries to take it away. As summer turned to autumn and the light grew softer across the fields, Liam realized that victory didn't mean things went back to how they were. It meant he had finally become the kind of man his father believed he could be. Quiet, resolute, and unmovable. The fight for the farm had ended, but the land and the life it carried had finally begun again.